first of all,
Thanks, Matt.
what is your read on the situation? Case numbers are meant to be higher today because of the number of people infectious in the community. How long is this lockdown going to last?
Yeah, look, there's a very worrying situation in Sydney at the moment. Case numbers continue to rise. The lockdown is continuing. People are homeschooling right across Sydney and the regions. It's a very difficult time for millions of people, and we need the financial support in place to make sure that we get through this very difficult period. But, you know, a sense of concern about the future right now in Australia's biggest city.
Look, it's really hard. The Premier keeps on saying she doesn't have a crystal ball, but does there need to be some kind of certainty, a ballpark figure of when lockdown might end?
Look, I think that these are very fine judgment calls. Obviously, they involve where the spread is happening, what communities are infectious, where the infectious communities are spreading it within the larger Greater Sydney region. Obviously, I think we've been calling on the health advice to be made public over the last couple of weeks so that we can bring the community along with the decision makers. Now, we understand these are very difficult decisions. No one's asking for a perfect scenario. I don't think governments are going to aim for, nor should they aim for perfection. But I think speaking up to the community and providing them with the evidence on which these decisions are being made will strengthen community support during a very difficult period.
Oh, indeed. And let's talk about some of the figures we do know. We do know that most of these new cases are coming out of 3 LGAs in Sydney. Is there an argument for those areas to be locked down harder?
Look, potentially, and if the government went that way, we would obviously want to talk with them first. Most of the representation is Labor members of Parliament in the state and federal caucus. So that could be the answer, but we would need clear communication for those communities. And people would have to understand in the Greater Sydney region, many people that work in those 3 local government areas will continue to leave those local government areas for work because they work in retail, transportation, or they're frontline workers. These are the people that drive Sydney. There's no stay-at-home option for them. So even if you had tighter restrictions in place, it could imperil or have knock-on effects for the major retailers in the Sydney metropolitan area. That's got to be part of this conversation. It's also another reason why, Laura, if you were going to have what would be a major escalation in lockdowns for that part of Sydney, the health advice needs to be communicated with those communities so they understand the seriousness with which governments have to grapple with.
Yeah, look, a couple of days ago we heard about the green shoots from Gladys Berejiklian, but it seems a couple of days later they've been trampled on, absolutely. Is there any evidence that you can see that these lockdowns are working?
Well, I mean, clearly the original lockdown didn't work, and it's self-evidently the case because we required further restrictions in Sydney. I'm sure the Premier would acknowledge that herself. But the key now is to make sure that transmission in the community doesn't extend beyond those 3 LGAs. We're calling on the government to have more vaccination hubs, pop-up hubs, particularly in the southwest of Sydney, to make sure the communication for non-English speaking background continues and that we have testing centres, mass testing centres, particularly a 24-hour one in Canterbury, which is closer to the CBD and a very big local government area in southern Sydney. I think that should be a priority for the government. Yeah. It may help curb what is a very difficult scenario. But Laura, look, I acknowledge this is a very hard situation for any government of any political persuasion. We just want to get through this horrible period.
You're right to point out that the area of southwestern Sydney, many of these electorates are represented by Labor members, your people, at both a federal and state level. So talking about, you know, whether there would be a 2-tiered lockdown or different rules for different parts of the city, I mean, if you were Premier today, what would you be considering? Maybe the lockdown as it exists at the moment in southwestern Sydney, but easing other areas?
Well, look, I mean, it's hard for me to speak in hypotheticals, firstly, because I don't have access to the health advice that the Premier does. But I would say that if a measure like that was pursued, it would the guiding principle, I'm sure, for every Labor member of Parliament would be it has to work. And if you've got such a majority of the working population in those communities will continue to leave their 3 local government areas, because if they didn't, parts of the retail sector may collapse, or transportation and food delivery may be severely impacted, and they'd get exemptions in any regard. Then we wouldn't want to see a system pursued that wouldn't ultimately work. So we want to work with the government, speak to us, release the health advice, focus on these communities. That would be a big decision. I'm not going to say right now that we're against it. If it's in the interest of curtailing this virus, it needs to be debated, but it needs to be done in an inclusive way because the stakes are quite high.
Look, fair enough, you don't have all the data available to you, but you do know these communities. Would you be concerned if there was to be different rules for different parts of Sydney, that you'd see more of that animosity we've seen between communities?
Look, I suspect the people of southwestern Sydney, if there was specific lockdowns for their communities, would accept it, provided the health advice was made public to them and it was very clear that it was a system that would work and they had confidence that it would work. Now, would I have concerns about it? Yes, of course I'd have concerns at this point because such a large proportion of that working population has to leave those communities under any circumstances. But if the government came to the table and said, this is what we require in order to curb what is a horrible disease, of course we would assess it. Our priority at the moment is to make sure we get through this horrible pandemic in as short a period of time as possible.
Look, what's the read on it? I mean, are we pursuing zero cases? Is it elimination? Is it suppression here? Because you and I both see the list of exposure sites every day released by New South Wales Health, and we're seeing the transmission happen in chemists, in supermarkets, in some of those essential areas. These are places that could never be shut down. So where do you go next?
Well, that's interesting that the government is saying, I think said yesterday at the press conference, that they're reassessing the ultimate goal. I mean, my understanding at the moment is the government setting the policies that are in place, the restrictions that have been imposed on Greater Sydney are about having zero cases in the community transmitting this disease. So if there's a change to that, it would have to be guided by the health advice. It'd have to be shared with the people of New South Wales. And it would be a major and dramatic change to the system that's been operating quite well, you'd have to say, for the last 18 months. But given there's been no government announcement on that, it's hard for me to comment on hypotheticals. The focus at the moment needs to be stopping the transmission of the Delta variant, seeing if we can get on top of what is a horrible disease.
Okay, well, just finally, there is financial support there on the individual payments that the federal government is paying for. It does seem that some people are starting to fall through the cracks, but on the New South Wales side, and this is business split with the feds, it seems that the grants, they're coming through, but we're also hearing that businesses just will not survive this with the support on offer.
No, they won't, and the federal government has got deeper pockets. They've got a successful program that they should be lauding and speaking about, which was JobKeeper. They unveiled in 2020. I think it's the reason that the Australian economy popped once lockdown lifted the previous time. And the idea that you go to some hybrid system to get through what is a harsher and deeper lockdown, I think is ill thought out. I hope common sense prevails because we've got a system that can work, that can see us get through the pandemic and have a strong economy on the other end. And I'd hate to see that imperiled because we've got some weird hybrid system that had to be developed on the run.
So you're having a crack at the feds here. Do you think that JobKeeper in many ways didn't cover a lot of the people that you see on individual payments, but could it be solved with just, increasing the percentage of payroll that you could be paid?
Well, at the moment, there's a Job Saver program in New South Wales. It's administered by the New South Wales government. There's a complicated process where you have to prove a downturn in turnover for 2 of the last 4 weeks before the pandemic came in. Most businesses I speak to in my own electorate are pretty puzzled by it. They had a system that worked last year, and ease of understanding is going to be a big part of how we get through this because we need financial support for these businesses. No one should go out of business because they've done the right thing and listened to their own government's health advice. And I'm worried that'll be the situation in Sydney at the moment.
Yeah, we hope not. Chris Minns, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Laura.